The two leading theories in physics, Einstein's gravity, known as relativity, and quantum mechanics, these two theories do not work when you bring them together. Federico Fagin is an interesting case. He had a mystical experience of his own that made him shift his view of reality, where he now believes, the last time I checked, that consciousness does not come from the brain, meaning that we all have experience, but the brain is more like a processing mechanism or a receiver or an antenna. Maybe consciousness is the basis of all reality. Maybe nothing's actually material at all. This is something multidimensional. Now, with regard to these alternative cosmology models, the leading alternative, and for your audience's sake, the way I like to frame this is that I think there are many holes in the conventional cosmological model. These lights, we don't know what they are. Some say that they're conscious entities. I think we do know, we have a lot of evidence that there are beings that people are encountering and have been encountering throughout history.
Do you think that the government is aware of this and they're just hiding it from us? And why would they be?
My view is that we exist in some kind of a spiritual war. But I think the underlying reality, even more fundamental than the spiritual war, is something benevolent. There's a huge bias in academia and even in the media. If you talk about things like the afterlife or psychic phenomena, that there's scientific evidence, there's a pushback.
Welcome back. Today we're exploring the fascinating intersection of consciousness, UFOs, and the true nature of reality with my guest. Mark is an award-winning author, speaker, and host of the Where's My Mind podcast. His End to Upside Down book series challenges mainstream beliefs about the world, presenting groundbreaking evidence that consciousness is not just a product of the brain, but the foundation of reality itself. His work suggests that what we perceive as reality may in fact be an illusion. Mark, thank you for joining me, buddy.
Thank you for having me. Yeah,
absolutely. So I've been kind of digging into your stuff the last couple of days, watching a bunch of podcasts, and what your book series is an end to upside down thinking, and you kind of touch on a whole bunch of different topics as far as medicine and the cosmos, and I'm just curious kind of how you got going on this journey and how you got started.
Well, I started while I was still working in a more normal job. My background is I went to Princeton for undergrad, then I went into investment banking in New York during the financial crisis of 2008 to 2010. And then I was working at a company in Boston and then Silicon Valley, advising technology-focused businesses that had innovations and patented technologies. So that's what my day-to-day was like. And I started listening to podcasts back in 2016. And I came across some ideas that sparked an initial curiosity that led me to read books and then to read scientific papers. And I quickly realized there was a whole paradigm of reality that I was not exposed to and that I didn't know of anyone in my network that even knew about this stuff. So it was a very strange period to try to evaluate whether any of this was real. And if it were real, how could it be that so many people that I know who are very intelligent had no idea that it had any reality? So the more I looked, the more I decided for my own thinking that I had to just shift my view of reality. And then about a year into this research, I decided to write a book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, which I wrote in 2017, but it was published in 2018. And really the rest is history. I came out with my podcast series on the same topic called Where Is My Mind in 2019. At the end of 2019 and early 2020, I decided to leave my firm in Silicon Valley. Even though I had spent about a decade there and had become a partner, I decided that I needed to devote my energy to things that I felt more passionate about. And I've now written on 7 books total. So I've written An End to Upside Down Living on the spiritual awakening path, An End to Upside Down Liberty, which is about political and economic theory, An End to Upside Down Contact, which is about non-human intelligence, including the UFO phenomenon and the influence on our society, An End to the Upside Down Reset, which is about the World Economic Forum's stated agenda, An End to Upside Down Medicine, which is a challenge to the allopathic approach to medicine, and most recently, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, which challenges mainstream cosmology. So I've kind of been all over the map, and each time I've written a book, I've just been pulled by a topic that I didn't necessarily know would pull me. And then I start researching it, and then I realize, wow, there's a paradigm shift here. I need to shift my own thinking. And once I wrap my mind around it, then I decide to put it on paper and share it with others.
It seems like kind of all those topics are somewhat intertwined, actually, like consciousness and the cosmos. I mean, if you look at this fine tattoo I got here, this is kind of it's a it's a UFO. And then I, got this dude here, a spiritual guy. This is all fairly new for me within the last year and a half. I'm not a woo-woo kind of a dude by any means. I was in law enforcement, military, pretty normal guy. But after doing ayahuasca, that opened my mind to a whole nother reality and entities and other stuff like that. And have you ever experienced any of those?
No, I haven't. I have worked with people who allege to communicate with beings, so lots of psychics. And when I started in 2016, I was mostly just studying from an intellectual perspective. I did have a lot of synchronicities in my life, so strange coincidences started happening. And then I worked with people who had psychic abilities and abilities to channel entities, allegedly. And they were able to do things and know things that I couldn't explain. But I've never encountered a being or anything like that. And I'm not sure I really want to.
Yeah, honestly, this whole UFO thing is from my ayahuasca journey, where I had done 4 different experiences to deal with PTSD, and but the funny thing was, after the first 3 nights, I was like, man, I'm pretty much healed, and I grew up on Art Bell. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but yeah, and so my dad was kind of into that stuff, and so I was like, yeah, man, I've healed everything. I sure would like to get beamed up by a UFO. And that was the wrong thing to ask ayahuasca, because boy, did it answer. And it was scary. It was terrifying, actually. But the other dimensions and being able to exit your body in consciousness outside of your body is 100% real. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind. It's, for those of you listening, I told Mark earlier, I'm battling the flu right now. So forgive me. I'm a little bit off kilter today, but I'm gonna stick it out. So,
wow. Well, what an experience. I've heard many people describe those sorts of things. I personally don't feel like I'm ready for that. If I could, I'd rather just stick with this world and the things that I'm comfortable with. And my research has made me more and more hesitant to go down those paths. Not that there isn't use for it, especially for things like PTSD. Like there are definitely benefits. I think it's case dependent, but there are negative entities that inhabit our reality.
Oh, yes.
And just being aware of that is important, and they don't necessarily have our best interests in mind. So I've heard many different shamans talk about the amount of preparation that's needed or training to be able to deal with these other realms. And I personally don't feel like I'm equipped for that, because I haven't done that kind of training. So I'm going to hold off. But I think it's important to hear all sides of this, because we do see a movement toward otherworldly types of experiences, or people even trying to invoke or call in ETs without having any substances. And we just need to be aware that there's a spectrum of types of beings. Some are very benevolent, or they seem that way. Others are definitely not. And others might be tricksters who appear one way and they can actually shapeshift into a new form. No,
you're 100% on point, because I mean, during that experience, night 2 was full of dark entities and scary, the scariest stuff I've ever experienced in my life. I actually wrote out every single night right after the experience. So, it's kind of a little bit all over the place, but it's pretty clear, and it's terrifying what I experienced, but also, the most healing stuff. But yeah, I wouldn't play around with it if you don't know what you're doing. I did it in a setting where the people had my best interest, and these shamans are legit and stuff. But you are definitely opening yourself up to, good, dark and light entities for sure, and maybe we don't need that. So.
Yeah. And I would also imagine that the experience itself gave credibility to the fact that we live in a multidimensional reality, and what we see on a day-to-day basis is not all there is. And that on its own, I would guess, is shifting for somebody, because it's like all of a sudden the veil's been lifted and you walk around in your daily life and there's so much more than meets the eye.
Yeah, there definitely is. And it has shifted a lot of things, and it is kind of hard to be in normal everyday life when that there's so much more going on out there. And like yeah, it makes your average going to work 9 to 5 job a little meaningless, you know. So yeah, it can definitely shift your perspective on things. I had David Weiss on. I was listening to a different podcast earlier with you, and you guys were talking about him. What's kind of your perspective on him?
Well, I actually did an interview on his podcast, and I've watched a bunch of his stuff. I have his app, the Flat Earth, Sun, Moon, and Zodiac app, and I think he's collected a lot of really interesting information that makes a thinking mind question mainstream cosmology for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's. I talked to him for an hour, and it was hard to counter anything he had to say, but getting outside of the norm and saying, yeah, I think maybe he's onto something. Everybody looks at you like you're freaking nuts. So
believe me, these are the things I had to consider. So my book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, the most recent one, goes into challenging mainstream cosmology and looking at alternative cosmologies, like maybe Earth is not a spinning globe, which on the surface probably sounds insane. But what also sounds a bit insane when you look into it is the current model that we're told about cosmology, and most of us aren't even taught to question it. For example, some might have a knee-jerk reaction and say, well, mainstream cosmology explains so much, so well. Earth revolving around the sun, day, night, seasons, we can explain everything. The problem is the basis for that model requires that 96% of the universe is mysterious dark matter and dark energy, which might not even exist and basically has been plugged in because it has to prop up mainstream cosmology. And on top of that, the two leading theories in physics, Einstein's gravity, known as relativity, and quantum mechanics, these two theories do not work when you bring them together. They're incompatible. The equations blow up, metaphorically speaking. So we're working with a cosmology where 96% of the universe is plugged in, dark matter and dark energy, and the two leading theories of physics don't work together. So by its own reasoning, mainstream cosmology is broken, and it doesn't work well. So basically what people are saying who defend the spinning globe, Big Bang, heliocentric model, and heliocentric means sun's at the center, not Earth. Earth revolves around the sun and heliocentric. Those who defend that model are basically saying, just grant me these few miracles and then I can explain everything for you.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. Have you ever dove into Federico Fagan? I was listening to some of his stuff today, and he was talking about consciousness.
Federico Fagan is an interesting case because he's such a highly credentialed scientist. He was one of the inventors of the microprocessor in the 70s. So he's a hardcore scientist, and he had a mystical experience of his own that made him shift his view of reality, where he now believes, the last time I checked, that consciousness does not come from the brain, meaning that we all have experience, but the brain is more like a processing mechanism or a receiver or an antenna. So it's not consciousness is popping out of our body, but our body is processing consciousness from an external source, basically. And this is just all metaphor and analogy. It's probably way more complex than that. But one of the implications of going in that direction, as Federico talks about, is that like maybe consciousness is the basis of all reality. Maybe nothing's actually material at all. And meaning that consciousness doesn't come from the world, rather the world is emerging within consciousness. Yep. And that leads to a bunch of interesting implications. So for example, Federico Fagan has spoken about artificial intelligence, because there are many debates about whether or not artificial intelligence will become conscious. Meaning, will consciousness just pop out of a computer when the computer becomes complex enough? And there are a lot of people who just assume that's true because they assume the brain's like a computer and it became complex enough one day and then all of a sudden we became conscious. Yeah. And they say, well, maybe that's going to happen with AI. The difference is that humans are biological and AI seems to just be made out of inert matter. And the question is whether biological consciousness that we experience could be experienced in one of those machines on its own. And what Federico says, and I tend to agree with him, is that we're not going to create new consciousness from these machines. But what I do wonder is whether or not the machines could become smart enough to integrate biological material into their own form and then become basically hybrids that could receive consciousness. I'm just theorizing here. We could get into some weird territory.
Let's go. I had a shaman lady on, and we were kind of talking about AI and consciousness and everything. And she said, well, all kinds of different entities can inhabit these AI, so it may not, all of a sudden this thing could become conscious, but it could be just an outside entity that is taking over this AI, ChatGPT.
Right. Yeah. And we really need to understand consciousness better in order to understand this question, because we know that we're humans and we have conscious experience. That's actually the only thing we can validate, is that at this moment, it feels like we're conscious, but we really don't understand how that occurs. I mean, imagine if we knew nothing about neuroscience and we were just living in a world where no one taught us anything. We would know that we're conscious because we're having experience, and it feels like our consciousness is up here near our head, but that's also where our sensory organs are, like our eyes and our ears. So it all feels like it's there. And I wonder, if we did a thought experiment, would our consciousness feel like it's up here if our eyes and ears were at our ankles, for example? I don't know what it would feel like. So, and we wouldn't necessarily have the capacity to study the brain if we didn't have any technology around, because we wouldn't be digging into our skulls. So we're also biased by the things the scientists tell us, and we jump to these big conclusions based on those things. And what I'm trying to do now in my own thinking is to start from scratch everywhere and assume no one told me anything. What kinds of beliefs would we have? And I think where we would land is, I don't know why we're conscious. We know we're experiencing it, but it's an abstract thing, Tim. Like, I can't point to your consciousness and draw it. Or mine. but yeah, what's going on?
Yeah, it's wild, and I don't think there's any real way of measuring it, at least not right now. So, kind of jumping over to the UFO, like extraterrestrial, what do you think that is? Do you think it's other entities? Are there actually beings that are on other planets? I mean, you're talking about the David Weiss, flat Earth. So, what are these things coming in? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, the way that I frame it in my book, An End to Upside Down Contact, is that there is a physical element of the experience, which has to do with UFOs and sometimes people encountering beings that appear to be physical. But there's a large portion of this that is multidimensional. So, for example, in a psychedelic trip, people encounter entities, or even in near-death experiences, people will encounter beings of light or religious figures or deceased relatives. Sometimes they will encounter someone who was not known to have died, and then they're resuscitated and they find out that person died. So they're encountering intelligences. So I think this whole phenomenon is probably way more complex than we hear about in the news, where it's oversimplified and they're focused on the crafts and the technology. And don't get me wrong, that's important, but this is something multidimensional. Now, with regard to these alternative cosmology models, the leading alternative, and for your audience's sake, the way I like to frame this is that I think there are many holes in the conventional cosmological model, and there are reasons to be skeptical of the spinning globe as it's been presented. But coming up with an alternative model is actually impossible currently, because we haven't been able to dig down far enough. Earth's radius, if it were a sphere, is supposed to be about 4,000 miles down, and the farthest we've been able to go is under 8 miles. And that expedition had all kinds of problems because their predictions were wrong. So we don't really know what's below us. And we don't really know what Earth looks like from above because we can't independently validate it. And we don't even have 24-hour footage of Earth as a spinning sphere, as a full globe doing a full rotation. All we have is basically little circles or disks that we get from NASA, and we get sometimes high altitude footage where you see maybe ambiguous curvature, and maybe it's a fisheye lens or who knows what it is, but we don't see the whole globe. We don't see a full sphere. We're asked to extrapolate. So we don't really have the evidence we need from above us. And then from within Earth, we haven't been able to explore fully. There's restrictions around the North Pole, but especially around Antarctica. The 1959 Antarctic Treaty has made it more difficult to travel and explore all of Antarctica. And certainly people take trips to one little portion. But is visiting San Francisco, does that mean you know about all of North America?
Yeah.
I mean, you need to really explore. So who knows what we're missing? And my point here is that unless we are able to observe all of these things, we cannot have a comprehensive model. But that said, the one that has been put forth very often is of a Earth as a topographical plane, meaning it has peaks and valleys, but it's basically a plane. And Earth is surrounded by an ice wall, which is Antarctica, meaning Antarctica is not an island at the bottom of a sphere. Rather, it's ice around a circle. And inside the circle is everything you see on the map of Earth, basically, the continents and so forth. And with that model, The sun and the moon and the lights in the sky are much more local. They're way closer and smaller. So it's not like you would land on the moon, so to speak, or you'd land on Mars, as we hear in a lot of science fiction. These lights, we don't know what they are. Some say that they're conscious entities. I wonder, Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a mystic from several hundred years ago, he wrote a book called Other Planets, and he spoke about being taken in his consciousness to other planets, meaning maybe these are actually realms, multidimensional places that you can go to, but not lands. But also this raises the question, if there is a wall around us, could there be lands way beyond the extra territories, as Dave Weiss would say? Yeah. So extraterrestrials could come from these other lands that are part of our plane, but we don't have the capacity to explore them because we're so limited into our little area. So I'm open to all of it. I just don't know. And I don't think we have enough evidence, but I think we do know, we have a lot of evidence that there are beings that people are encountering and have been encountering throughout history.
So do you think that the government is aware of this and they're just hiding it from us? And why would they be?
It's a great question. I wonder this all the time because I would guess there are many people, including PhDs and people in high positions of authority, who propagate a narrative innocently that might be false because they haven't looked at the underlying assumptions. So they just assume it's true because they trust the experts and they have enough circumstantial evidence to say, okay, well, I'm guessing that they're right. But then there must be some people who know, and who they are, I don't really know. Yeah. But if we just think about the difference between, let's just say, a flat Earth cosmology, a topographical plane, versus the spinning globe. The spinning globe emerged after 13.8 billion years ago. There was this big bang in an unimaginably far away place. So long ago, we can't even comprehend it. And all of a sudden, there was this massive expansion. And through the random interactions of pieces of matter, we end up with human life, but we also end up with solar systems and galaxies and Earth as one little tiny pale blue dot revolving around this massive gas giant, the sun, out of one of many planets in our solar system and one of many solar systems out there. And there are many other stars. And so we're this tiny little speck in a cold, meaningless vacuum, basically. And we are insignificant in this massive universe because we're just one little tiny speck out of something much bigger. Now that can create for people a very nihilistic perspective that maybe human beings are not special in any way. Even people who have a spiritual perspective will believe this and say, yeah, we are special in that we're part of consciousness, but we're still this we're pale blue dot in a vast universe. Versus, what if Earth occupies a special place and is at the center of the observable cosmos? And maybe we exist on this plane and there is some kind of enclosure, which is known as the firmament. If that's true, then it's very easy to think, maybe there was an intelligence that put us here. If we occupy a special place, that's a very big difference. So maybe the powers that be want to hide from us our true importance. And that could keep us in a state of enslavement, a state where we always want to offload our authority versus, maybe there's some kind of intelligence underlying reality that we could all tap into and it's being hidden from us. That's point number one of why cosmology could be hidden. Now, point two might be more just practical and financial, which is that maybe there are elements of reality, for example, the ether, which would be compatible with these ideas, these alternative cosmologies. And the ether is known as the fifth element, and that was kind of taken out of physics starting in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But the ether might be something related to free energy. And if that were hidden, for example, then maybe there wouldn't be the scarcity that we are told we have in terms of energy. And maybe there are even physical resources that are being hidden because we don't have a proper map, or maybe it's in Antarctica or beyond Antarctica and we're just not allowed to go there. So because of this artificial imposed scarcity, we end up having to effectively be enslaved in our lives and then have to offload our authority once again. So if we adopt, for example, the worldview of the Toltecs, and I learned this from Joel Schaefer, who's a Toltec shaman. This is the Mesoamerican tradition, like in Central America. The idea is that there is a parasitic entity that is in our world, and we don't always see it, but it feeds off of us. The fear that we think we experience is actually not native to us. It's this parasitic entity, and many of our thoughts are not from us. We are feeling the thoughts of this parasitic force. So if you buy that idea, then enslavement is the perfect way for this parasitic entity to feed off of us, for us to be in a state where we're offloading our authority. We don't feel like we can fully be prosperous because we're always in a state of scarcity. We think we're insignificant. And under that perspective, you wouldn't want to wipe out all of humanity. You just want to keep it at a limited population and control it and then feed off of us as an energy source. So at a really deep level, maybe that's what's going on. And I say all of this speculatively, but it's something to consider.
Yeah. Do you think that parasitic entity would be, I mean, you have good and bad entities. Would that would be obviously be on the bad side of things, but do you think I kind of am under the belief of, there is a higher power, a creator. I believe in God. What that exactly looks like, I don't know, and nobody else does, but I know that I feel like there is this intergalactic battle between good and evil and fighting for people's souls, literally. And I mean, that's what I've experienced personally through psychedelics and just got a little glimpse of it. But I don't think I was hallucinating, the things that I experienced. They were realer than real. And so I'm just curious, what is your take on God or good and evil?
My view is that we exist in some kind of a spiritual war. Mm-hmm. But I think the underlying reality, even more fundamental than the spiritual war, is something benevolent, because that's what people say they experience very often. They talk about different layers of reality and maybe different psychedelics take people to different parts of it. And in the Toltec tradition, they use the dream world to enter different worlds. And some of the worlds feel realer than this one. But there might be an ultimate reality underlying everything that people have described where they talk about unconditional love. So I think there's something benevolent, but we end up with things that get in the way, that block our perception of it. And we might call that variations of evil. Mm-hmm. And when you extrapolate that and multiply it by an infinite possibility, we probably end up in the spiritual war where there are forces of so-called good that want to return us to that unconditional love place, and others that are trying to get in the way of it, like clouds blocking the rays of the sun. The sun's always there shining its rays, but clouds can get in the way. And through that process, in theory, one could learn through very, very difficult lessons or just experience diversity. Because if you just had unconditional love, you wouldn't experience lots of things. And I'm saying this all very speculatively, try to make sense of it. But that might be what's going on. And we almost like the movie Inception, where there are dreams within dreams within dreams, worlds within worlds, consciousnesses within consciousnesses. Maybe it's something like that. Yeah,
I would say it definitely is. I mean, I've definitely experienced different levels of entities to where you're, I can't even get into it right now. I'm so sorry. It's been a rough day. So I'm hanging in there as best I can. So can you kind of jump into your latest book a little bit more and just kind of hold me by the hand?
Yeah, sure. So this is the book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos. If it sounds crazy, we'll talk about it here, but I would recommend actually reading it. And these topics that I talk about and write about, I write a book because they're not things that can just be discussed in a short conversation. You need to be walked through each line of reasoning. And that has been my experience, at least. So let's just ignore the concept of shape for a second. And because people often want to fixate on flat, and they get stuck in, well, are you talking about a pancake that's revolving around the sun and every other planet's a spherical shaped thing? And why is Earth like that? It doesn't make sense. You're going to fall off the edge. Let's forget about the shape for a second and instead talk about Earth's place in the cosmos. And I mentioned the term heliocentrism earlier. That means the sun's at the center and Earth revolves around the sun. This came from Copernicus and Galileo, and most people in modern society, they take it for granted. Of course, we revolve around the sun. We are in a state of free fall, actually, at over 60,000 miles an hour. That's what scientists tell us, and we don't feel any of that. While we're also spinning on a tilted axis, or rotating on a tilted axis, at over 1,000 miles per hour, or roughly 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, which is faster than the speed of sound, and closer to the poles on the sphere, it's much slower. We're also rotating around the galaxy at over 500,000 miles an hour. And we're part of an expanding universe because of the Big Bang. There's this expansion in the universe. We're moving at over 1 million miles an hour in this expansion, but we don't feel any of it. And it's the scientists tell us because we just don't feel it. It's all happening, but don't worry, don't trust your senses. But in any event, that model puts Earth not in a central place in the cosmos, but rather in this just random speck, versus an ancient concept known as geocentrism. Geo meaning Earth at the center. That's pretty different. And what I was shocked to learn when I researched this topic was that mainstream physicists like Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking and many others will readily admit that just by observing the lights in the sky above us, we cannot tell the difference between geocentrism and heliocentrism. They have this form of equivalence that's pretty crazy. But what's happened in modern society, we have been so biased toward the heliocentric version, the sun-centered version. And what I learned is it's because there's a philosophical preference towards it in science. Stephen Hawking, for example, said that we believe it on principles of modesty. Oh, we shouldn't occupy a special place. We're not that special, basically. Or Edwin Hubble, who was part of the expanding universe idea, which led to the Big Bang Theory. He talked about the idea that we were at the center. That was an unwelcome proposition. It would be intolerable, a horror. He used very strong language, and I quote him directly in the book. So what's happened is that scientists have observed phenomena, and they've decided to fit it into the idea that Earth is not at the center because that's what they prefer. And we end up with these complex models of an expanding universe and a Big Bang, and then we end up with 96% of the universe being dark matter, dark energy, and all this stuff, largely because we are force-fitting everything into the idea that Earth moves around the sun. Think about that for a second.
Do you think that's because of the religious aspect of things? They don't want Earth to be at the center of anything. We're just a little speck, like you said, out floating through space. Yeah,
that's a great point. There is an aversion to ideas that sound like there's an intelligent creator, because that's religious, Tim. That's just superstition. That's what spiritual people believe. They're not scientific. And I've seen this throughout so many areas that I've studied, but especially in the field of consciousness. There's a huge bias in academia and even in the media. If you talk about things like the afterlife or psychic phenomena, that there's scientific evidence, there's a pushback, because they'll think, well, that's just ancient beliefs, and we have transcended that. We're more evolved than those ancient people who used to believe in spiritual things, and they were just superstitious. So I think you're right on that the scientific community has wanted us to go toward heliocentrism. And also what happens is that people succumb to a logical fallacy, which I find myself talking about all the time. It's called affirming the consequent. And I want to spend some time talking about it because it applies not only to cosmology, but it applies to reading the news, in politics and economics, consciousness, everything, where basically people jump to a conclusion about why something happened, and they don't realize that there might be other reasons that the thing happened. So in other words, they jump to a causal model based on observations, and they ignore other causal models. The very technical way of saying it is, if X, then Y. We observe Y, therefore X. And let me say it more simply. If it rains, the grass will be wet. No problem there. We observe that the grass is wet. Therefore, we conclude that it rained. Think about that for a second. That's dangerous territory because you ignore all the other reasons that grass could be wet, like dew or sprinkler systems, or maybe there are elements of biology we don't understand. We could come up with a million possibilities of things that we should be exploring. But what happens? We get stuck into a model. Oh, it rained because rain causes wet grass, and we see wet grass, so it rained. And then we observe new things in the world and we force it into the model that it rained, and we ignore all other possibilities. This is what happens. Just like with heliocentrism, we get stuck into a philosophical preference. There are certain observations, for example, the way the lights move in the sky. If heliocentrism were true, we would see the lights moving in the sky that way. That's right. We see the lights moving in the sky that way. Does it mean that heliocentrism is true? No, because there are other models that can explain the lights in the sky, like geocentrism, which is what Einstein and Stephen Hawking said. But we've gotten locked into heliocentrism. We've gotten locked into, well, nope, it rained. So if we observe anything, we've got to make it fit into the model that it rained. Because look, Tim, scientists established this so long ago. Who are you to challenge them? And you can see how this happens. We get locked into a model, and if you question the model, you're a heretic. But it's because of this logical fallacy that it's easy to get stuck in. Again, I'll say it a different way. A model that can accurately explain observations isn't necessarily the correct model. There might be other models that can explain the observations.
Yeah. So what's going on like with people that go up to blast off to space? You know, are they lying to us? Are they just going to a certain height and then there's nothing else? Because I mean, I've dove into, you know, a little bit into the moon landing, and now they're saying, yeah, we can't even get back to the moon now, you know, 50 years after it already happened. Like, what are they? I'm just curious, like, are those people actually, they're going to space, Well, so what are they doing? Like, how high are they going?
I mean, it's a great question. I really don't know what's going on. And let me preface this part of the discussion by saying I'm much more interested in talking about the science behind this stuff. But then you're forced by definition into asking these questions because they're incompatible. What we hear from the space agencies literally does not fit with these anomalies in science.
Yeah.
So I was forced in this book, An End to the Upside Down Cosmos, to include a whole chapter on space agencies and to look at the moon landings and to look at the ISS and to see what's going on. But let me first say that if we look at basic pressure physics, which has been discussed by physicists like Dr. Stephen A. Young, a theoretical physics PhD, he wrote a book called A Fool's Wisdom, and he evaluated this stuff. He said in his book that he cannot know, he's not sure with 100% certainty what this place is, but he knows with 100% certainty what it's not, and it's not a spinning globe. That's what he says. And one of the arguments he makes, again, theoretical physics PhD, highly trained guy, and has been looking at this for years. He didn't believe it at first either. But he talks about this idea of basic pressure physics, which is like if you have a can of soda, there's a lot of gas pressure in there, and you open the can of soda and it makes a loud noise. And the loud noise is there because of a basic principle of reaching an equilibrium of gas pressure, where in the soda can, there's a lot of gas pressure. Outside the soda can, it's a lower pressure system. When you open the soda can, there's an equilibrium that's reached. And it makes a loud noise because the high pressure from the inside goes to the low pressure in the outside until there's this homeostasis. Basic stuff that no one would disagree with. So then the question arises. Earth, under the globe model, is sitting next to a near infinite vacuum of space, meaning almost infinitely low pressure. But Earth has an atmosphere that is still here, meaning the gas is staying here on Earth. But wait, if Earth has higher pressure as a higher pressure system sitting next to this unimaginably low pressure system of a vacuum, why aren't we seeing the same thing like we see with the soda can, where our atmosphere goes out into this vacuum to equalize, basically? Why doesn't that happen? And what people like Stephen A. Young and others say is actually that's impossible. Mainstream physicists would say, well, gravity holds it in. So we have a peaceful atmosphere sitting next to the vacuum of space, even though there's this immense differential, an immense pressure gradient, gravity holds it all together. And there are a lot of reasons to question gravity, which we could go into also, but it becomes actually an implausible belief system. And you can have insects that defy gravity and actually fly straight up. So gravity is a weak force in some ways, but it's strong enough to hold the oceans on a ball and hold in this pressure gradient. What many people say is, nope, not possible. Earth must be a closed system. There must be some enclosure, and this is like a firmament. And then if we're a closed system, we get into all other possibilities of maybe it's not a vacuum of space out there. Maybe it's a fluid medium, like the Bible talks about. We talk about the waters above and waters below. And there's a documentary by the host of Crow 777 Radio where he has been taking his telescope out for years, and he started to observe, when he was looking at the moon and other celestial bodies, what looks like a wave, like you'd see in some fluid medium, passing through the moon and even outside the moon. And I think you saw it a little bit in Jupiter too. So we don't know what's out there, but the point is, there's got to be an enclosure based on basic physics. So right there, something's wrong with the narrative that we hear from space agencies, because they're talking about, at least with NASA, going to the moon, which they say is 238,000 miles away, and the sun is allegedly 93 million miles away, even though when there's an eclipse under the mainstream model, it looks like the sun and the moon are roughly the same size, roughly the same distance away. And it just happens to be that their distances and sizes equalize, so they look like they're the same size, but they don't. They're not the same size, and they're not different distances. You know, that we get into these paradoxes where they try to make excuses. But in any event, the mainstream model of cosmology says the sun and the moon is 238,000 miles away. So you end up going really far away from Earth's surface. You end up having to go outside into this vacuum of space. How's that possible if we know there must be some kind of enclosure or something? So automatically we know there are problems, but then when you actually dig into NASA and ignore all the problems with physics and the problems with gravity, which we haven't even talked about, but let me touch on it briefly. Basically, because I think this will make the NASA stuff a little more believable. In 1933, there was an astronomer named Fritz Zwicky who was observing the Coma cluster of galaxies. And basically the observations of this cluster of galaxies, it didn't match Einstein's relativity, which is Einstein's gravity, basically. There was missing mass. to the degree of over 99% of the mass that needed to be there for Einstein's gravity to work, it wasn't there. So there were two options. Option one, we need to rethink all of gravity. Option two, actually, there's mass there. We just don't know what it is and we can't observe it. We're going to call it dark matter. And this is part of the 96% of the universe that is unknown. So this is a hot area in science to try to understand what is dark matter. The problem is that there are scientists, including astrophysicist Pavel Krupa at the University of Bonn in Germany. He and his colleagues have spent over two decades looking at this. And what he says very clearly is that we have looked at the observations predicted by the theory of dark matter, and they're not there. Dark matter does not exist. We have falsified it with over 5 sigma confidence, meaning 99.9999+% confidence. So you see the house of cards here, because if you needed dark matter to exist in order for gravity to be correct, what happens if you falsify dark matter? That means you effectively falsified our understanding of gravity, and we have to rethink why the apple falls to the ground and why things move. It might not be because of this mystical force called gravity. There might be something else. So now that gravity's a big problem, we have to look at everything NASA's telling us, because they presuppose gravity in a normal way, and they're doing these missions talking about gravity and everything else. But how could these things even be true? And then we see anomalies all over the place, like the telemetry tapes. This is the data from the Apollo missions. Don't exist anymore. And there's a NASA document that says, yeah, they're gone. I mean, that's pretty wild.
Yeah.
But then there are other anomalies, like Bart Sibrel, who's been a leading moon landing skeptic. He has a documentary called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. And he was going to present a documentary trying to look at NASA's footage. And on the bottom of the pile that he received from NASA was this video footage that basically said, not for public consumption. So we don't know why this. Did someone accidentally put it there, or did someone inside NASA want to give it to him? But this is in his documentary where he shows the Apollo 11 astronauts on some kind of, who knows what it is, some kind of aerial craft, faking the picture of Earth that they were allegedly taking on their way to the moon. It was a transparency that they put in the window, and you can actually see them doing this, and you can hear them speaking with someone on Earth. Maybe, who knows, maybe intelligence agencies, we don't know what it is. So that puts a lot of questions into what's going on with that. And then if you look at some of the ISS footage where they're claimed to be floating around, there are many instances where people are floating or objects are floating and then something falls. So it's like, wait, no. How could something fall when you're in zero gravity or low gravity? So there's one video, it's one of my favorites, of an astronaut who says, sometimes things do fall because there are gravity pockets. He said, I'm going to show you. So he's got one thing floating in the air, and then he has a playing card in the other hand. And he drops it and it falls straight down. And he goes, see, that's a gravity pocket, which is pretty interesting because the ISS, the International Space Station, is supposed to be moving at thousands of miles an hour. So it's like, how could you trace where that little pocket's going to be and know this one's floating and this one falls? Yeah. So I hope that gives you a little teaser as to we got problems here.
Oh yeah, we definitely do have problems. But I think that there seems to be more of a push for like disclosure, whatever that looks like. And I know they're talking about, entities and UAPs and all this stuff is slowly kind of being leaked out to people. Do you have any insight on why that's happening now, or is it just it's too much to keep under wraps nowadays?
It's really hard to know what's coming out and why, and whether there is truth with falsehood that is being put out, or if they're just trying to steer the narrative because they've been lying for years. I really don't know. I will say that having looked at the history of, let's say, UFO phenomena and the way governments have handled it, it's hard to think that we should just magically trust them. So I think there's a combination of skepticism needed with critical evaluation. So there can be a blanket way of looking at this, which is anything from governments is automatically false. And I think that's a dangerous mentality. I think we should evaluate everything critically, but we should also understand that governments have been dishonest in the past. So there's this balance that we need to strike. All that said, I really don't know what's going on, because sometimes you have disinformation agents who are literally there to give you false information or to give you enough truth to make you want to trust them and then lead you astray with the most important stuff. So I think we should be very careful. But then also there seems to be something, I think it's positive generally, that this is becoming more mainstream because it's making people, think about where we were 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago, talking about UFOs. Now it's mainstream. And
Yep.
that's got to be opening people's minds to a broader reality. And to me, that's a net positive.
Yeah, it'd get you locked up 20 years ago, or they just think you're crazy. What else am I missing, man?
We can talk about the afterlife if you want.
Let's go.
Sound good?
Yeah, I like the afterlife. I don't think it's the afterlife. I just think it's the continuation. So
Yeah,
I
that's
would
a good
love
way to
to.
put it. Yeah, the
Yeah,
term afterlife kind of maybe imposes a false narrative on it.
yeah.
But this was a big one for me when I started in 2016 because I didn't think there was any reality to an afterlife. I thought when you died, that was the end of your consciousness. It's like a
Mhm,
computer shutting off.
mhm,
But there are independent pieces of evidence that to me suggest that consciousness continues, like you said. So it's just sort of one consciousness having a variety of experiences in maybe different dimensions or different perspectives. And we might call it the afterlife, or we might call it a psychedelic dimension, but it's really one continuous thing in some way. But the near-death experience has been one of the more powerful things that I've looked at. And this is where people are in some kind of crazy trauma in their body, cardiac arrest, clinically dead sometimes, and the doctors are just trying to resuscitate them.
mhm,
But because the resuscitation technology has gotten so much better in the last several decades, there are more and more people coming back. And the stories that they tell are surprisingly consistent. The vast majority of the stories is that people had a positive experience in their consciousness. Sometimes they're immersed in unconditional love and they have this new understanding of life that completely changes them. There is a small percentage of people that come back and they've had hellish experiences. They're not well understood by the researchers, but they are reported. They seem to be inconsistent, and we don't even really know the percentage because people who have these experiences might be more shy about telling people because there's so many people who associate near-death experience with positive things, and they might not want to seem weird. And maybe they just had such a traumatic experience, they don't want to talk about it. So I've heard estimates, 1 to 5% are hellish. Maybe it's more. That's just a general range. Whereas the vast majority are positive experiences. And in some of these positive experiences, there are just miraculous things that happen. For example, Anita Morjani, one of the most famous cases. She was dying of cancer. She had tumors all over her body and she went into a coma. She had this experience in her consciousness where she encountered her deceased father and she resolved all sorts of conflicts within herself. She came back after, and she was resuscitated. Her tumors disappeared. No surgery. And the doctors couldn't figure out what was going on. And now she's cancer-free and speaking all over the world. So that's just one example out of many. Some people will have life reviews where they relive their whole life in a flash. And I actually did a podcast series on this in 2019. It's called Where Is My Mind? It's still available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Just 8 episodes, meant to be a bingeable show. And I interviewed many people who study these phenomena, and I interviewed some people who've experienced them, like Daniel Brinkley, who's had multiple near-death experiences, 4 of them that he described with me in the interview. And each time he had a life review where he relived his life. But he not only relived the events from his own eyes, he also became each person that he affected during his life.
Wow.
So for him, this was very traumatic because he was a Marine who fought in Vietnam, and he told me that he was vicious in combat. And I remember he had trouble talking about this with me because he was so visceral what he went through. He felt what it was like to be the people that he killed in combat.
Wow.
He also felt the pain of children that would no longer have a father again because he killed the father in combat. So needless to say, this was life-changing for him. When he was resuscitated, he changed his whole life, became much less materialistic. This happens to a lot of people, by the way. But because he had such an overwhelming life review, he actually became a hospice volunteer.
Wow.
Where he worked with people who were dying, veterans in particular, because of his military experience. And then during his later life reviews, when he had these other near-death experiences, which he didn't know he was going to have, he did relive the traumatic stuff again in combat, but he also got to relive what it was like to be the dying person.
Oh, wow.
Looking into his own eyes and being comforted. And he got to feel the peace and the love in that experience. So you feel the good and the bad things, allegedly, from these life reviews. And for me, it was just eye-opening to know that these other realms of experience exist. Often people feel like there's a sense of being home. I interviewed a man named Dr. Alan Huguenot, who had a near-death experience as well. He encountered a being of light, basically, that he felt like he had known throughout time.
Mm-hmm.
And he felt like he was being held like a baby's being held in a parent's arms. And he felt the sense of familiarity. So that raises all kinds of questions. Do we have an amnesia about the nature of reality, meaning we just don't remember it, but a part of us remembers it? Mm-hmm. And this brings us to topics like children who have past life memories. This is research that's been done at the University of Virginia, their Division of Perceptual Studies at the med school. So highly credible researchers since the 1960s. Dr. Ian Stevenson and now Dr. Jim Tucker at UVA studied over 2,500 cases of young children, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, who start speaking about a life that's not theirs with incredible detail. So much so that the researchers sometimes can find historical records to validate what the children say. And this is not like saying I was Cleopatra or some famous figure. It's very obscure often, like a Hollywood extra or a World War II fighter pilot, where there are very specific details that you can't imagine the child could have known unless the child had access to that past consciousness. Now, and I think some of the most compelling cases, the children not only have memories or even preferences or things that they're afraid of that don't make sense, like they might crave food that doesn't make sense in their culture, or they might want tobacco even though it's not around them, like weird things, or they might fear things that don't make sense. But they also sometimes have physical deformities and or birthmarks that align with the way they claim they died in the previous life. Whoa. So what is going on there? Yeah. Because the researchers sometimes can find medical records that validate what these little kids say. And sometimes the children, there's a paper on this written by, co-authored by Jim Tucker at UVA, when they study the cases of children who seem to have reincarnation type memories. Some of them also have intermission memories, where they speak of a time before they were born. And they talk about choosing their parents. So this goes back to the idea that I was discussing earlier, that maybe the idea of our life, which starts at birth and then ends at death, that's a very limited time frame, that there's stuff before and after, and maybe time doesn't even exist. So it's all happening simultaneously. But that is just a mind-blowing concept, which should make us question everything about everything.
Yeah, I definitely believe that. And, I kind of subscribe to Earth as kind of like a school for us, for our spirit, for our soul. I mean, we, are in a different spiritual dimension, and then we come here, we learn, we grow, maybe, we get to pick our experience, and then we die and we get evaluated on how we did, and maybe we do it all over again. I mean, I wrote out every one of my ayahuasca experiences. I'm going to email them to you. You don't have to read them, but they're very eye-opening, and believe me, much more articulate than I am right now. But some of the stuff that you experienced there, I've been down there. I went to Costa Rica, did it all legally and in a licensed medical facility. But some of the experiences you have there, like on the last night of this 4 ceremony, this last time I was down there, I'm sitting there in front of a fire and just kind of focused, just thinking. And I look over and there's a girl next to me, and her name is Chantel. And she was my ex-wife's 14-year-old sister that I hadn't thought about in 20 plus years, who had been killed in a car accident. And she's right there. And I literally said, Chantel. And it was, she didn't say anything. She just sat there, and I was like, man, and then she just disappeared. I was like, man, that is weird. So I couldn't help myself. The next that morning, I texted her mom, and I said, hey, this is going to sound really weird or whatever, but I'm at this ayahuasca retreat, and I saw Chantel last night, and I just felt like compelled to tell you that I saw her. And she said, wow, that's pretty incredible, since today is her birthday. I'm like, what? I hadn't thought about this chick in 20 years, So I believe it was her. I know it was her. And she didn't say anything, but I think she was just giving me that little, message to pass along to her mom on her birthday, 20 years after she had been killed, that she's okay. It's crazy, So our consciousness and, what's happening all around us is not the complete picture by any means. and so I've had a lot of kind of experiences like that. I would love it if you read kind of my journey, if you are bored. It's wild. It is wild, and it may push you to want to experience some of this stuff just because like you're talking about it and you're extremely articulate and know exactly what you're talking about, but to experience it is a whole nother level. So that's what kind of drew me to you. I was like, man, this guy is talking about, I would have bet $1,000 that you'd done it before just based on what you talked about.
Yeah, well, that's what everyone tells me, that it's like they try to use words, but the words aren't even adequate. You can't compare it to anything. But I want to just bring more validity to some of this if your audience is skeptical. One is sort of along the lines of what you described, where people encounter an entity that brings about knowledge that can be verified. In this case, it wasn't verified, but it was on her birthday, and like that's pretty interesting. But like Dr. Bruce Grayson from UVA says that these cases where people encounter a deceased person that they did not know had died and would have had no way to know had died, and they encounter that energy of the person in the altered state, and then come back and tell people, and they're like, wait, how did you know that? It's a verification that brings clarity. And so good.
Just to kind of touch on that, and I mean, I got all kinds of stories, but my brother was killed in a car accident in 2007. And the night he was killed, I was laying in bed and I woke up in a panic at like 1 a.m. I was like, I thought my brother was dead. And then I was dealing with PTSD and anxiety and stuff like that. So I was like, I'm just tripping, I go back to sleep. About 4 hours later, my dad called me and told me that my brother had been killed in a car accident. So I did receive that message, which was freaking wild. Why he would tell me that, I don't know, or why I would get that knowledge ahead of time, I don't know. But when the phone started buzzing and it was my dad at, 5 a.m, I already knew what was up. Like it was wild. So my dad was a pastor, so I've been in the spiritual game for a long time, and so I think if you open yourself up to that kind of thinking, you may encounter a lot more than other people are really closed off to it. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know, because we've talked about dark entities and light entities, and you're kind of inviting that stuff into your life when you dabble in those type of things. So, I won't push ayahuasca on you, but it is a interesting substance. And I wonder, like, if, it is dimethyltryptamine, DMT, like, is that breaking us out of our consciousness? Is it some sort of portal? Have you studied any of those compounds?
Yeah. I mean, and some people believe that near-death experiences are a result of chemicals like that are produced by the body. So it's sort of like it's a product of the brain rather than anything that's real. But researchers like Dr. Bruce Grayson from UVA have looked at the compiled evidence where people compare the descriptions under various psychedelic substances, including DMT, with the near-death experience, and they're not identical. They might have features that sound similar, but they're not the same. And he mentions ketamine as the one that's closest to the near-death experience, but not the same. And he talks about people who have experienced both certain psychedelics and near-death experiences, and they say they're not the same. So there might be other realms. I don't know how it works, but maybe these compounds do have an ability to break through the filter. If our brain is filtering out these other realms, it might be that certain compounds break us through to different realms. Because when I hear people talk, it sounds like the ayahuasca worlds might be different than just like the DMT elves. I don't know, maybe, or the mushroom world, or the 5-MeO DMT world experience. There are some differences depending on what people take and the way in which they take them. So maybe they're distinct realms. I don't know. Does that sound right?
I think they are, because I've experienced different realms. I've seen, the checkered patterns and entities kind of poking their heads out. And I've heard Joe Rogan talk about that stuff, the elves, whatever that means. But I've experienced a little bit of that. And then I've experienced the angelic realm and then the UFO realm. So, I mean, it's wild. And I've had 12 different experiences, so I'm starting to become a pro at this, but I don't know if I'll do it anymore. Talking to you, I'm like, maybe I should reel it in. No, it's been really, really good, really healing for me. And, I recommend, for veterans or people dealing with PTSD, anxiety, stuff like that, to give it a shot. If you've tried everything and it doesn't work for you, or hasn't worked for you, then I recommend trying it. But if you're living your life and you're good to go, maybe don't mess around. So, Mark, what am I missing, man? We got anything else we need to cover? How do people get your books?
All the books, there's 7 of them currently. They're on Amazon in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats. I narrate the Audibles myself.
Right on.
I have a website. It's markgober.com, markgober.com. And as I mentioned, I have an 8-episode bingeable podcast series called Where Is My Mind? Where Is My Mind? And it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the places you get podcasts.
Right on, man. I will link all that stuff in the description and throw it up on the screen. I appreciate you taking the time. Once again, I apologize. I just hit a wall the last couple of days. I almost pulled the plug on this one.
I'm sorry. Well, I hope you feel better. And I think we still covered a lot of good ground.
I think we did, man.